For me, the hardest part of an exhortation, besides actually getting up and delivering it, is to coming up with a theme. I find that the hardest challenge, and often it's a verse that might jump out at me when we're doing the readings, and that's the case with this exhortation with 2 Corinthians 4. I'll get you to turn that up if you haven't already got that still open. There was just one verse that really jumped out at me and made me start thinking. It made me think of the recent census, the census that we had last year. I'm not sure whether you've seen the results of that. They put it out progressively. They don't sort of give you all the information at one time. They provide a little bit here, and then they update that a little bit more there as it goes through. And there were some interesting figures that I did see in what they had submitted. For instance, 25% of Australians live on their own. That's quite staggering when you think about it, isn't it? 1 in 4 people. And the population has doubled in the last 50 years. But the interesting part, it was when we looked at religious belief in Australia. That was obviously something that I was particularly interested in. In 1911, so just over 100 years ago, 96% of Australians identified with Christianity. They ticked the box saying they were Christian. But by 1996, so it's 80 years, so a fair reasonable time, it had just drifted down to 71%. So it was a little bit of a shift, but you know what? In the last 10 years, that shift has been absolutely dramatic. Gone from 96% to 71% over 80 years, and then in the last 10 years, it's skyrocketed. It's actually quite amazing. It's down now to 44% of Australians identify as Christian. It's in the last 10 years, it dropped from 61 to 44%. And the people that ticked no religion, it's not as though they've gone from Christianity to something else, they've now moved away from God altogether. People that ticked no religion has gone to a massive amount of 40%. It's almost doubled in the last 10 years. There's now 10 million people in Australia that say, I have no religion whatsoever. That's a staggering number when you think just 100 years ago, 96% of people said they identified as Christians. There's some staggering figures, aren't they, when you think about 10 million Australians have no religion whatsoever, don't identify with God in any way, shape or form. And it's very clear, I think, that the world is heating up. It's really progressing, going downhill, if you like. It's going into a depression, a darkness, as it were. The further we move away from God, the more we move into darkness. So when we looked at 2 Corinthians 4, it was verse 3 and verse 4 which really interested me. Verse 3 of 2 Corinthians 4 says, "But if our gospel be hid, it is hid to them that are lost." If our gospel be hid, and that's the word veiled. It's like a reference to Moses with his face veiled. They couldn't see clearly through to God. They couldn't really see what the laws were trying to teach them. It was veiled. And it says, to those, or to them, that are lost. Another translation puts that, to those that are perishing. Our gospel is veiled to those that are perishing. You see, God would have all men to be saved. You know that. But not all men would be saved. I saw a cartoon where there's an image of Jesus on the cross, and he's clearly, they've drawn it so he's suffering, and it's clear that he's going through a lot of pain, and there's just someone walking down the street and looking up at Jesus on the cross suffering and saying, "No thanks." And that's really what we're seeing in society today. That's the shift that we're seeing. 40% now, no religion, nothing to do with God. They're making a choice. But why are they doing that? Look at verse 4. In whom the God of this world has blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. So in whom the God of this world has blinded the minds. The God of this world. So that's singular. It's not the gods of this world. The God of this world has blinded what? The eyes, that's what you normally blind, has blinded the minds of them which believe not. The mind there means the perceptions. It's blinding the perceptions of those that believe not. Well, the God of this world, what's that? What's that all about? Well, really, it could be anything, couldn't it, really? Anything for us, it could be importance. It could be our career. It could be material possessions. It could be like me, gym and working out. You're supposed to laugh because that's not true. Bodily exercise profits little. I always like to quote that. I put it to you, brothers and sisters, the God of this world is ourself. It's humanism. It's self-interest. The humanism teaches that there's no need for God, that we can solve all the world's problems ourselves. Ultimately, it becomes all about us. But they don't realise that people that are following that religion, as it were, become the problem. That's why we're seeing an increase in the race riots and protests and climate change activism and things like that. It's all about being able to solve the world's problems ourselves. We just get together. We don't need God. We can do this ourselves. That's what the world is worshipping. That's what I believe is being referred to here as the God of this world. Ultimately, it's us. It's all about us. Of those that believe not, in verse 4. The ESV says, the unbelievers. And we just saw from the census, 40% are now unbelievers. This is the situation that we're dealing with. This is really here and now. It's just growing and growing. They've been blinded mentally to what? To the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God. The gospel of the glory of Christ. Another translation puts that. The gospel, the good news of the glory of Christ. So God's anointed, God's love. Jesus, the very image of God that we've seen on that cross that we've just walked past. No thanks. They're blinded to the reality of that hope, of that love. It's ready there. It says, ready to shine unto us. But their minds are blinded. It's closed to that glorious hope. Is it any wonder, brothers and sisters, that the world is growing darker and darker, further and further away from God? What did Jesus say in John 8? He says, I say to you, you're from beneath. I'm from above. You're of this world. I'm not of this world. You see, there's that contrast there. Jesus is focusing on God and on light, that glorious gospel. The world is focused on self-fulfillment, of achieving things ourselves. Their minds, their perceptions, they're blinded. When you're blinded, you can't see, can you? It's just total darkness. We were in the Warrumbungles not so long ago with our van. We were camping there in the national park, and we had a little caravan there. The light was on, and decided I needed to go and use the amenities. And I stepped outside. It was probably 9 o'clock at night. It was absolutely pitch black. When I closed the caravan door, I could not see my hand in front of my face like that. Other than being underground like Dave, never experienced such blackness. It was just total blackness. I had no concept. I had a little torch. That little torch gave me a little radius. But other than that, there could have been a saber-toothed tiger just on the other side of that piece of light. I wouldn't have had any idea. It was just so black. And I thought as I was walking up to the Amandes, that's what this verse is talking about. It's talking about being blinded, about not having any idea of what we're doing, of where we're going. If I hadn't had that torch that produced light, there's no way I would have found my way to the toilet block. It was just total blackness. It's incredible. And so we have it. They're blinded. Total darkness to the glorious gospel. You see, so we have a contrast. That's what Paul's telling us here. We've got this world. We've got not of this world. We've got beneath and above. Darkness and light. And ultimately, death and life. Turn with me if you would. We'll come back to 2 Corinthians, but turn with me if you would to 1 John. Without light, there is only darkness. You can't discern. As I said in the Warrumbungles, I couldn't discern my hand, let alone which direction. 1 John 1, verse 5. This is the message which we have heard of him, and declare unto you that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. See, God is the exact opposite of blindness. God is the exact opposite of darkness. With God, there's only light. If we say, verse 6, that we have fellowship with him and walk in darkness, we lie and do not the truth. If we're very good at fooling ourselves, aren't we? Human nature is, we can talk ourselves into thinking anything, really, and believing that that's the right thing, that we're doing the right thing. But John is saying here, if we're not walking with God, we're fooling ourselves. We're living a lie. If we want to follow the world's ways only lead to darkness, only lead to death. We want to get caught up in social justice and acceptance. That's the things of humanism. That's the things of the world that lead only to death. Man's not going to solve the problems of this world. We walk in the light, verse 7. As he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another. And the blood of Jesus Christ, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. You see, the focus here is on God, on his ways. If we have fellowship with God, we have fellowship with one another. He cleanses us from all sin. But if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. That's the world's thinking, brothers and sisters. You see, you take God out of the picture, there is no moral compass anymore. There is no concept of sin. It's only when we have God that we understand what is right and what isn't. Without God, it's just darkness. Every man has to do that which is right in his own eyes, because there's no other basis for making decisions. You take God out of the picture, how do we make a decision about what's right and what's wrong? It's interesting, an article I read regarding the census and the drift away from religion. It's not really a drift anymore. It has been, but it's more like an avalanche now. It says, as a child growing up in Sydney's eastern suburbs, I was raised in a devout Irish Catholic family whose members attended church every Sunday. It's this generation, she said, we all grew up with religion. When you start living your life, you realise you don't identify with it. And see, I thought the telling part there was when you start living your life, that means when you take your focus away from God and you start focusing on yourself. Since the church's socially conservative teachings on same-sex marriage and sex before wedlock seem outdated to most young people today, she said. And you know, when the Marriage Act was changed in 2017, there were 25,000 same-sex marriages counted in the next census. You see, there's no moral compass, no basis for making decisions. It's interesting when you look at things like Proverbs. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear Yahweh and depart from evil. And that's the issue. You see, humanism has always been with us. The concept of doing whatever you think is right. Getting together and going in a certain direction to solve the problems. In fact, you know, moving away from God, making decisions without God has always been with us. Even from the garden, you know, when God gave Adam and Eve instruction and he left them in the garden to make those decisions on what they were going to do. And we know these verses well, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and it was pleasant to the eyes and the tree desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also to her husband with her, and he did eat. See, there's no mention of thinking about God there, of what he wanted. It was all about me, what was going to satisfy my desires, my lusts. So a couple of chapters later, even though it's 1,500 years, when God saw the wickedness of man, that it was great in the earth, and every imagination of the heart was only evil continually, God looked on the earth and saw it was corrupt, or rotten. For all flesh had corrupted his ways upon the earth. Every imagination of the thoughts of the heart were only evil continually. You can see the thinking is all about satisfying me. They're not thinking about God. A couple of chapters later, the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before Yahweh exceedingly. Jude talks about even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in like manner. You see, not only was that behaviour abhorrent in Sodom and Gomorrah, but the cities around them were being influenced. It says they were likewise giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh. You can see how man allows himself to be influenced and corrupted when you take God out of the picture. See how natural inclinations come out. They allowed themselves to be influenced. Their natural urges, their impulses, their weakness were given free rein. Isaiah says, the show of their countenance does witness against them. They declare their sin as Sodom. They hide it not. Isn't it amazing that the homosexual movement is called gay pride? It says, they hide it not. I'm taking great pride in what I'm doing. They hide it not. And you know what? That's to be expected. Once you move away from God, once your mind is blinded to the glorious gospel of Christ, once you're moving further and further into darkness, you're going to be making those decisions. Further and further from God. And you know what, brothers, this is the scary part of this. If you come over to Philippians 3, look how Paul talks about those in the ecclesia, that were in the ecclesia. This is the scary part, I think. We can all say, well, yeah, that's people that are, perhaps really didn't have much in the way of religion anyway, and it wasn't much of a step from them from going sort of, yes, I'm a Christian, when they really weren't, to nothing. But Paul says in Philippians 3, verse 18, but many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ. Paul's talking about brothers and sisters, believers in the ecclesia. He says, I'm weeping to actually describe them like this. They're the enemies of Christ. They're walking as the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things. Another translation puts that the way they live is leading them to destruction. They've replaced God with their own desires. They do shameful things and they're proud of it. Pride, whatever form that takes. It's all about me, about satisfying my urges and my lusts, my desires. They're proud of it, of what they do. They think only about earthly things. Wow. That's amazing, isn't it? These are brothers and sisters in the ecclesia, and look what's happened to them. They've been caught up. The God of this world has blinded their minds. They've allowed themselves to drift into darkness. Well, that's quite depressing, isn't it? But let's come back to 2 Corinthians 4, and we're just going to finish here. A couple of beautiful verses. You see, like those in Philippians, they were making a choice. They were thinking only about earthly things. We likewise need to make a choice and keep making that choice. Look at verse 6. For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, has shined in our hearts, to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. What a beautiful verse that is. God has commanded the light to shine out of darkness. The world can only offer darkness. Do whatever is right in your own eyes. God's commanded the light to shine out. He's given us direction. He's given us a focus. He's shown us where we can go. It's like coming out of the Warren Bungles and having this bright light. We can see everything. We can see what's going on in the world. We can see the direction we need to go, and we can see our end destination. He's shined in our hearts, in our minds, to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. In the face of Jesus Christ, the one we come to remember this morning, the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of our Lord Jesus Christ. See, the battle that the world is waging, the battle that we have to fight, and we are in a battle, brothers and sisters, is in our minds. It shined in our hearts. That verse 6 where it says it shined in our hearts, that's actually the same word as in verse 4 where it says it blinded the minds. It's our perceptions, it's our thinking and our understanding. We're being indoctrinated every day by the world, subtly. Our challenge is to focus on the light, the glory of Christ. Paul's warning in Romans. You see, brothers and sisters, all through the ages have been dealing with this. It's nothing new. It's just coming to a head. It's building momentum. Paul's warning is, be not conformed to this world. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove. It's the only way you can tell what's right and what's wrong. By looking at God and his ways. Then you can prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Chapter 11, we won't turn to it, we'll just stay and finish off in 2 Corinthians 4. Paul says, I fear lest by any means as the serpent beguiled Eve. That means completely deceived. As the serpent completely deceived Eve through his subtlety, so your minds, your perceptions should be corrupted from the simplicity or the singleness of Christ. It's the warning for us, brothers and sisters and young people. The serpent reasoning can fool us if we allow ourselves to go down that path, to lead us astray. But the encouragement today, the encouragement from Paul and the exhortation is to stay focused. Focus on simplicity of Christ, the singleness of Christ. We have the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. If we follow the world, we're just going to walk into darkness, step off the edge. That's what the world's offering us. But with Christ, we have light. We have life. We can see where we're going. We have direction. We can see the glorious future that lies ahead of us. So we finish in verse 17 as we now come to share in the emblems. Our light affliction in verse 17, which is but for a moment, works for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things that are not seen. For the things that are seen, they're temporal. They're here, they're gone. But the things that are not seen, they're eternal.